Hello, everyone. My name is Amanda Wallmeyer, and I am the local history librarian here at Johnson County Library. Thank you so much for attending today's program, The Past is Prologue, the Dockum Drugstore Sit-in. The Past is Prologue is a bi-monthly program offered by Johnson County Library, where we highlight topics that are often left out, glossed over, or misrepresented in our history books. We would also like to begin today with a brief land acknowledgement. Our Kansas City institutions stand on the homelands of Native American peoples at the juncture of the Missouri and Kansas rivers. In recent years, these nations have included the Delaware, Kansas, Missouri, Oto, Osage, and Shawnee. We pay respects to all the indigenous peoples, past, present, and future, for their continuing presence in this land and the land where you may be joining us from tonight. So now, please join me in welcoming Prisca Barnes.
Thank you, Amanda. Thank you for the invitation to be here this evening. I'm really excited to share this Dockum story with you. I want to give you just a little background about me. I am a native Wichitan and a product of I left Wichita to attend college in Atlanta, Georgia, but returned to obtain my master's at Wichita State. And then I went on to have this really interesting journey in the nonprofit world. I've served as the executive director of the Kansas African American Museum in Wichita. And then I founded a children's literacy nonprofit, Storytime Village. That is where I currently serve. And our mission is to inspire a lifelong love of reading for underserved Kansas children from birth to age 8. Now, you might be wondering, what does a director of a children's literacy nonprofit have to do with the story of the Dockum Sit-in? Well, I want to share that I served as the youth advisor for the historic NAACP Youth Council, the youth council that conducted the 1958 Dockum Sit-in. And as an NAACP advisor, I quickly learned that most of the students that were a part of the program that I was leading had little to no knowledge about this important part of the council's history and this impact that it had made on the world. And then I realized that it wasn't just the students that were not really informed, but many adults in the community knew little about the sit-in. So it became a personal mission to share the Dockum story. And I worked through my literacy nonprofit to make sharing this story a reality. 2018 marked the 60th anniversary of the Dockum Sit-in, and with the support of Humanities Kansas, the People, Pride, and Promise Project was created. The project is a documentary, which you'll see parts of the documentary throughout this presentation. It is a traveling exhibition that before COVID traveled to libraries throughout the state. And it is also a recently published children's book that received the Kansas Notable Book Honor. So today, all of these decades after the Dockum Sit-in, you can still see the impact that the sit-in has made. You can see that youth are still making their voices heard in contemporary nonviolent protests. And it is my goal to make sure that this story is heard all across Wichita, throughout the state of Kansas, and even the nation and further abroad. I want to share about the participants that stood on courage, persistence, and careful planning to give the civil rights movement one of its greatest weapons in the struggle for equal accommodations. So I want to share with you, and I'll start with a presentation. So I am, as I share with you, a literacy nonprofit director or founder, and I love to tell a story. And so tonight, let me tell you a story of a people with pride and promise. And this is the story of the Dockum Sit-in, America's first student-led lunch counter sit-in. So it is said that a picture is worth 1,000 words. And we all know how powerful and vital the role that imagery played in shaping the racial and social justice movements. An image can declare to the world that the high courts have banned segregation in public schools. An image can show the heartbreak of a mother whose son was lynched for allegedly whistling at a white woman. An image can display the determination of a woman who dared to challenge the transportation laws in our country. Imagery fueled the civil rights movement. And today, images are telling stories and compelling people to action. But what if there were no cameras to capture the fight for equality? What if there were no news stations to cover the story on the evening news? What if there was just one small newspaper to capture just one picture? The story could easily get lost, and the contribution could somehow be diminished. A now grainy image of the Dockum Sit-in participants captured by a local African-American newspaper is the only image captured and preserved from the sit-in. So that is why tonight I want to paint a picture for you that will bring new life to the Dockum Sit-in story and help you to see how a group of young people changed our nation. The 1950s was a time of great conflict. Racism was rampant in many parts of the country, especially in the South. The civil rights movement was exposing the divisions in American society in the South and throughout the nation. And while there were many significant acts that took place outside of the South to move the civil rights movement forward, most are simply not familiar with the fight for civil rights in places outside of the South, with the exception of the Topeka, Kansas, 1954 landmark Brown v. Board of Education Supreme Court case, which ruled unanimously that racial segregation of children in public schools nationwide was unconstitutional. However, in 1958, another courageous act took place right in the heart of the nation, the Dockum Sit-in. To your far left in the white suit or the light colored suit is Ron Walters. He was the president of the NAACP Youth Council. Next to him was Herbert Wright. He was from the National NAACP. And the young lady with the flower dress on, her name is Carol Parks Hahn, and she was the cousin to Ron Walters. And then next to her is a woman that I stepped into her shoes as the youth advisor. She was youth advisor of the NAACP Youth Council, Rosie Hughes. And when I think of these young people, I just think of courage and determination. There was nothing that would stand in the way of this determined group of NAACP students. Segregation wouldn't stand in their way. And like many places in the nation, Wichita, Kansas was segregated. Now, colored-only water fountains and bathrooms were the norm in our country, but Wichita had its own segregation issues. One being that Black children and white children weren't allowed to swim in the same pools together. But that would not stop this determined group of young people. The fact that they were attempting to change rules that had never been changed before would not stop them. Fear would not stop them. Threats would not stop them. They were determined. They were on a mission. They would not stop until they were successful.
The Dockum Sit-in. On July 19, 1958, a group of Wichita, Kansas NAACP Youth Council members filled the stools at the Dockum Drugstore lunch counter to protest the store's discriminatory practices. A Kansas law created in 1874 prohibited unequal service in public places. However, restaurants in downtown Wichita still did not equally serve Black patrons. The Dockum Drugstore was one of the most popular eating establishments downtown. They also had a reputation for discrimination. The Youth Council knew that if change could happen at Dockum, change could happen anywhere. For 3 trying weeks, the students sat with patience, waiting to rightfully be served. Through their unwavering persistence, the Wichita NAACP Youth Council conducted America's first student-led lunch counter sit-in. Their story is one of hope, faith, struggle, and triumph. This is the story of the Dockum Sit-in.
We honor these young people because they conducted their courageous struggle against segregation. Those were the words of Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. at the 50th anniversary of the National NAACP Convention when he recognized the 1958 Wichita Youth Council for their successful Dockum lunch counter sit-in. The sit-in was America's first successful student-led lunch counter sit-in and was led by the Wichita NAACP Youth Council, a group of mostly high school and college students. And the Wichita Youth Council's bold and courageous acts were a testament to the many children, teenagers, and young adults across the nation who participated in meetings and marches as forces of change in the civil rights movement. And when I think of these courageous youth, their fight for equality, there are 4 themes that come to mind: hope, faith, struggle, and triumph. We're going to explore these themes tonight, and we will begin with hope. Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. once stated that only in darkness can you see the stars. So I have a question for you. What does hope look like? Can you describe hope? Not the dictionary's definition, but something tangible. So think in your mind how you would describe hope. And while you're thinking, I'm going to share this image with you. So if I were to describe hope as a person, I'd say hope looks like a bright and determined college student named Ron Walters. Remember that young man with the white suit on? That's Ron. Walters was a 20-year-old college student when he organized the Dockum Sit-in 1958. He was bursting with expectation for change. And while away at Fisk University, a historically Black college in Nashville, Tennessee, he was inspired to do something to change the unfair treatment of the people in his own community. And that's what he set out to do in the summer of 1958. Ron was from Wichita. And when I talked with past Dockum Sit-in participants and community members that were growing up during the 1950s, they described Wichita to me as an exciting place. They said that especially downtown was an exciting place to be. There were lots of busy shops and restaurants, and many African Americans worked downtown. And during Ron's summer break from college, that is exactly where he chose to work. But working downtown, as you can imagine, didn't turn out to be what Ron expected. Blacks were not allowed to sit and eat at restaurant lunch counters because those lunch counters were reserved for whites only. Ron and his friends would have to take their food to go from the back. And it was clear to Ron that if something was going to be done about the segregation issue in Wichita, it had to begin downtown. And what better place to make a big impact than one of the most popular eating establishments in Wichita, the Dockum Drugstore. The Dockum Drugstore was not just popular, it was a part of the national Rexall chain of drugstores and was the largest chain in Kansas. And it also had one of the worst reputations of discrimination. Ron was certain if change could be made at Dockum, change could be made anywhere. So to help give you a better picture of Ron Walters, the living members of the Dockum Sit-in described Mr. Walters as a born leader. They said he even dressed the part, carrying a briefcase and wearing a necktie when he was just a young boy. He was always ready to conduct business, so it wasn't a surprise when he took on the role as president of the Youth Council for the Wichita NAACP, and his cousin Carol Parks joined him as vice president. Carol's family would host many of the prominent civil rights leaders in their Wichita home, including the mother of Emmett Till, the young boy who was lynched in Mississippi and sparked nationwide outrage. The two cousins proposed to the Youth Council their idea to host a sit-in at the Dockum Drugstore. And it didn't take much convincing because many of the youth in the council had already participated in sit-ins and protests of stores and restaurants that weren't serving equally. And they were fed up with being treated unfairly, and they were ready to take action. Dr. Galen Vesey was one of the humanities, well, he was the humanities scholar for this People, Pride, and Promise project. And I got the opportunity to travel throughout the state with him, and he would share stories about his experiences during this sit-in and in his experience living in Wichita during the 1950s. And so he shared in the documentary many stories about that experience.
NAACP national figures would come to town. Ron got the idea that this may be something we should do here, because it was obvious he had experience, I had experience, because we had worked downtown.
At Dr. Walter's core was really one idea. And I don't know where that idea came from, whether it was his family, whether it was the environment he was nurtured and raised in here in Wichita. I don't know where it came from. But the core of Ron Walters can be narrowed down to one basic idea. What does this have to do with the liberation of black people?
We were blacks, and Wichita was alive and well in terms of racism and segregation. They didn't mind black folks sweeping floors, cleaning toilet stools, taking care of white babies, but there were limitations.
So all throughout the 50s, the civil rights movement was building momentum, and the Wichita Youth Council was compelled to join the youth, young people across the nation that were making bold and courageous stands against inequality. And they were fueled by Emmett Till's lynching and the Montgomery bus boycott that occurred just a few short years earlier. They were inspired by the courage of the Little Rock Nine, a group of students who desegregated the Little Rock High School in Little Rock, Arkansas. It was clear that the young people of the civil rights movement wanted change, and they would even face violence, or in some cases, even jail to get it. Many teenagers and young adults across the nation were doing their part to end unfair practices.
Good afternoon, boys and girls.
Good afternoon, Mr. VC.
We had no idea, some in high school, some in college, that the effort that we undertook was going to be so successful.
Were you scared?
You know, that's a good question. Some things had happened in the nation. In 1955, there was a young black male named Emmett Till who had gone from Chicago to Mississippi to visit his relatives. And he had a lot of cousins there, and he wanted to show them how much he was not afraid, he was a man. Emmett may have made a mistake, though, and that cost him his life. He was accused of whistling at the white store on his wife. He was really killed very cruelly. You wouldn't have been able to know who he was by virtue of the way his face looked. And his mother wanted him to be left that way when he was put in the casket, because she wanted the world to know what Ugly had done to her son.
Why did you want to go to the downtown drugstore?
Good question. Dockum's was part of a chain. For the most part, blacks were not welcome in eating places unless they carried their food out. You know, it took over a year for our planning, and we did some rehearsal so we'd know what to expect. And we had a little fun with that, but we were treating each other cruel because we had a feeling that that's what we were going to have to expect, that they weren't going to roll out a carpet and say, you black folks are welcome. One of the things that the adults in the NAACP wanted to do with black children, primarily in Wichita, was to come up with an activity whereby we were striving for some level of justice that we weren't able to appreciate and to experience at that time. Example, blacks, for the most part, could not sit down at the lunch counters and eat.
Now, fighting for racial equality was nothing new to blacks in Wichita, especially for attorney Chester I. Lewis Jr., a well-known lawyer in the community. In the 1950s, Wichita was considered one of the most segregated communities in the state. And Lewis, president of the adult branch of the Wichita NAACP, was known for fighting against discriminatory practices in the city. I was told that Chester Lewis was a proud man. They said he was a strong man, and he was not afraid to fight for what was right. When Chester set out to make change, I was told that change happened. When blacks couldn't swim in whites-only pools in Wichita, Chester changed that. And when the aircraft companies in town were segregated, Chester changed that. His determination inspired the youth council, and he gave them his blessing to move forward with the sit-in. Chester mentored the youth and gave them hope that they would be successful in their sit-in. So we talked about these themes, and we started out with hope. So you should have heard the hope in the bellies of these young people throughout this time that we've been talking. And the Dockum story is a story of hope, but it is also a story of faith. Scripture says that faith is the substance of things hoped for and the evidence of things not seen. The NAACP Youth Council was stepping out on the faith that they were going to see a change that no one in their community had ever seen before. And with the help of their youth advisor, Rosie Hughes, the Youth Council began preparing for the sit-in in the spring of 1958. And they spent months preparing and training. The students trained by role-playing in the basement of St. Peter Claver Church. Ron Walters was convinced that the work in the church basement would help them to be prepared for the unknown while sitting on the stools at the lunch counter. What would they encounter? They soon would find out.
We were fortunate enough because we had members who were part of the church family here to be given permission to do some role playing downstairs, which was a small but important part of what we were trying to accomplish.
The sit-in officially began on July 19, 1958 at 10 a.m. The students took turns filling the lunch counter stools, and just as they expected, they were refused service. However, the youth were determined, and they intended to stay at their post until they were served. The manager was not pleased and would rather close the fountain than serve the black students. A sign was placed on the counter stating this fountain temporarily closed. Now this brings us to the theme of struggle. The great abolitionist leader, author, and orator Frederick Douglass stated, "If there is no struggle, there is no progress." 1 week, 2 weeks, 3 weeks, the students sat with patience waiting to rightfully be served. And for those nearly 3 weeks, the Youth Council endured threats and scare tactics and a continued denial of service at the Dockum Drugstore. And one day, in particular, during their sit-in, While the youth council, while they were sitting at the lunch counter, a group of white youth came to the store to start a fight and to disrupt the sit-in. The police were quickly called and the gang left. But just 2 days later, a larger gang came back. And this time, however, when the police were called, they refused to step in and help the youth council. So Ron called on help from Chester Lewis. Remember I said he was strong and he wasn't afraid? He called on Chester Lewis, and Chester brought a group of neighborhood boys by the carloads to their aid. And they scared off the bullies. But the incident shook up the youth council, who were starting to get weary, seeing no progress with the sit-in. And they wanted to see the change in policies, and they were getting weary not seeing that happen.
We wanted to have with the same respect and dignity as white citizens to be served at the counter.
We still have to go back in time and think about the fact that this was a time when restroom facilities were segregated, when folks were still riding at the back of the bus, when there were multiple classes on the train, you know, if you were going from one place to the other. And just think about how deeply ingrained racism and segregation was all over the country.
The sit-in participants may have been getting weary, but they did not realize that triumph was on the way. I love this quote from Ghanaian author Layla Akita. She says, "If you stay determined, the obstacles cannot stop your progress. You will triumph over every mountain." Now, I'm the daughter of a pastor, and I've been rooted and grounded in the traditions of the church. And so I can just imagine on Sundays back in 1958 what it looked like and how it felt. I was told that that was the day that everyone dressed to impress, and the ladies wore lovely hats, and the young men wore their neckties and finest suits. And on this particular Sunday, I could just imagine Ron Walters picking out an extra special necktie because attorney Chester Lewis had called a mass community meeting at New Hope Baptist Church. And everyone was going to be there to support and encourage the Dockum sit-in participants. Dr. Martin Luther King always recognized the power of music as an instrument of change. And I'm sure on this Sunday, there were songs being sung to encourage the youth. Songs like, "Ain't gonna let nobody turn me round, turn me round, turn me round, ain't gonna let nobody turn me round, I'm gonna keep on walking, keep on talking, marching up to freedom land." The next day, August 11th, 1958, with a new freedom-fighting protest and courage, one by one, the youth began filling the lunch counter stools at the Dockum Drugstore, and suddenly, the door to the Dockum Drugstore opened, and standing in the doorway with the sun to his back was Mr. Dockum himself, the store owner. He walked in the store and stated, "Serve them. I'm losing too much money." Those words ended the sit-in. The lunch counter at the Dockum's Drugstore was no longer whites only, and now open to everyone in Kansas, and eventually all Rexall drugstores in cities all across the nation, large and small. Today, over 60 years after the Dockum sit-in, you can still see the impact that the sit-in has made. Youth are still making their voices heard in contemporary nonviolent protests.
What I think young people can learn from the 1958 NAACP Youth Council
is that it really takes courage to do the right thing. It takes courage to speak up when you see an injustice taking place. And what they can learn is that we want them to be empowered to do the right thing anytime they see injustice anywhere.
Understanding that just them doing a simply sitting in there and hoping for the best actually changed everything.
As quietly as we began, after 3 weeks, 4 weeks, it was over.
We're talking about a dozen, 2 dozen people over the course of the couple days, right? And yet managed to transform not just that one little business, not just the block around it, but the entire city and the entire country, inspiring the sort of later actions that happen in other parts of the country.
Knowing that you are a part of this bigger humanity, that you can contribute and also you can withdraw from. And so that these children in this climate where sometimes it seems like we're far from it, we know that the triumph is there. We know that we have a past and shoulders to stand where we can lift those babies up and let them peer into the future and see their place and see how they can continue to grow and make a difference.
Today, the youth are at the forefront of the nonviolent civil rights movement.
Show me what democracy looks like!
This is what democracy looks like!
As president of the Wichita NAACP Youth Council, I look up to Ron Walters. He organized the Dockum Sit-in, and that to me means a lot because as the president, I have the role of leadership.
The Dockum Sit-in is a great example of just how powerful these sort of small groups of dedicated people can be.
I mean, if somebody's not going to give you the power to do something, then you just empower yourself. You don't have to sit around and wait for permission. You don't wait on a yes. You don't wait on a no. You don't wait at all. Well, I saw opportunity to really give some people that didn't think they had a voice to get them opportunity to speak out. But around the United States, there was a lot of things that were going on. In Ferguson, you had they were setting the city on fire and things of that nature. I wanted to try to bring some of that here, but just without tearing our city apart, because when you do demonstrations like that, the whole focus is to really build it up. But you saw when they were doing some of those demonstrations that a lot of cities were getting burned down, our neighborhoods, and it was really the neighborhoods of the people that were really trying to say something. They were tearing their own neighborhoods down. So what I wanted to do is try to just bring that here in a fashion that can give us a platform to express ourselves, but just kind of minimize all the damage that was being done to the communities.
Every single successful movement that you see in this country starts that same way, with a couple of usually young people, young people who are grounded in and rooted in the experience of their elders who advise them and guide them through the process, right? They don't just do this all by themselves. There are usually wise older folks around them to help steer them without taking the leadership away from the young people. Starts with that small group, and then they manage to succeed.
At the end of the day, I'm trying to do the same thing that those people at the Dockum Sit-in were doing, and is just say some things that are not easy to say in the way that's not easy to say them. We have to include ourselves, because time after time after time, we're looking at this picture that we know we're supposed to be in, but we can't find ourselves. So now this is our time to put ourselves in the picture, like Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. did, Malcolm X, Huey P. Newton, the Dockum Sit-in. They put themselves in the picture that they know where they're supposed to be in, but they can never find themselves. So I just told everybody, this is our time to put ourselves in the picture.
Dr. Martin Luther King, we keep talking about him because he really was a part of this story. Dr. Martin Luther King wrote in his autobiography, "The courage is an inner resolution to go forward despite obstacles. And that pretty much sums up the story of the Dockum Sit-in. It is a story of faith, hope, struggle, and triumph. And with courage and endurance, the story inspires us all. So now that you know the story of the Dockum Sit-in, the sit-in that took place right in the heart of the nation, I encourage you to share this story with others so that we can continue to inspire generations with a story of a people with pride and promise. And now the story will no longer be limited to just one grainy image, but together we will continue to tell this story and paint a vivid picture for the entire world to see. Thank you.
All right, thank you so much for that presentation. That was wonderful. I'd like to remind the audience, if you have any questions, please put them in the Q&A thing at the bottom of your screen. In the meantime, Prisca, would you go back over some of those pictures from the very beginning so people can really look at them?
I can. There's lots of images. If you remember at the very beginning, we were talking about how the civil rights movement was fueled and moved forward through imagery. That's how the civil rights movement was able to make its major impact. And so I shared with you some really impactful moments in our civil rights history that moved the movement forward. So the first image, we have the Brown v. Board of Education. This was Emmett Till's mother at his funeral. Rosa Parks. This is the Little Rock Nine. Dr. King. A Man March. And then we move that forward to today and this generation and this time where our cameras have been very impactful when it comes to fighting for social justice. So those were some of those images.
Yes, thank you. Mm-hmm. And just to remind everyone, the timeline here, this was 1958, correct?
This was 1958.
So 2 years before the Woolworth sit-in.
Yes.
And 4 years after Brown v. Board.
Yes. And so it is really important. When I shared that I traveled with Dr. Galen Vesey, one of the Dockum Sit-in participants, and he's very humble. And one of the reasons why this story was untold for many years was because there were no images but this image. But then another reason is because of the humility of the participants. They did what they needed to do, and then they didn't talk about it. Dr. Vesey's father passed away not even knowing that he participated in the sit-in. So these young people, they wanted equality and equity, but they weren't boasting about the change that they actually made happen. And so when I would talk to Dr. Vesey, he would kind of cringe every time I would say the first, and he would say, why do you want to say that we're the first? And I say it's important for people to understand history. You have to have that historical timeline to know what happened and where it happened. And one of the reasons why I talk about the Brown v. Board of Education story is because a lot of people, they kind of gloss over the heartland and what was happening in the Midwest. And it was not just Wichita. So we started it. And then right after Wichita, Oklahoma had a sit-in. So we were pioneering, and it was something that the NAACP and the national NAACP did not want to kind of attach themselves to, because these were young people and they were not trying to own up to that. But it was the summer after. The reason why you heard Dr. King so much in this presentation was the summer after the Dockum Sit-in, the successful Dockum Sit-in. Dr. Martin Luther King acknowledged the sit-in participants at the National NAACP conference just 1 year after, and he called them courageous young people. And so we have to know the timeline and be aware of that, because when you don't know your history and you don't know when and how things took place, you're missing the entire story. We want to tell the whole story.
Mm-hmm. Yes, definitely. We've had a question. You mentioned traveling with Dr. Vesey. Were you close, or did you interview or talk to any of the other participants?
Yes. Living in Wichita, I've just had the wonderful opportunity to know many of them personally, and serve in organizations with them. Carol Parks Hahn is my sorority sister. And the youngest participant, Peggy Wesley, is a member of an organization that I'm in. So I get to see her and sit at her feet often. Not so much lately because of COVID, but prior to that, I would get to see her often. Another participant during the time that we had the documentary, Joan Williams, we invited her to come to the premiere of the documentary, and I was not aware that Joan was battling cancer. And I really was not aware that the day of the premiere, she had gone to chemo that morning or that day, but she pressed her way to come, and we celebrated her and other participants. And it was not, I don't even think it was a week later, she passed away. And so we had wonderful pictures with her. We were able to just give her love. And I was so amazed at her persistence in coming out, and, when she didn't have to, but she did. So I've had a really great, and then pre-COVID, I was an active member of the NAACP. And so we would see a lot of the participants, and then others that were really great parts of the community that were supporters of, the work that these courageous young people at the time did in the community. So I am grateful that I live in this community and that I'm a part of the community where I'm able to see living legends on a regular basis.
Mm-hmm. You mentioned Peggy was the youngest. How old were these young people? Were they all teenagers, or did it span an age range?
So they were high school and college, and I believe Peggy was 15. Mm-hmm. And many of them weren't telling their parents.
Fair enough.
That's how Galen Vesey's father didn't know, because they weren't telling their parents what they were doing. They were kind of afraid. So Galen Vesey said, Dr. Vesey stated that he was afraid his father could lose his job. He said, what if, Mr. Dockum is playing golf with my dad's boss, and he says, that old Vesey is stirring up trouble at my place of, my business. And then, so he was afraid that his father could be harmed, or, something could happen. And so he kept it a secret, and he kept it secret for years.
Yeah. Would you talk more about the documentary and where they can watch it?
The documentary. So that the documentary, there's another documentary that was created for the 50th anniversary And we created this one for the 60th. And we did so because we wanted a documentary that could bridge generations. And so you'll see in this documentary that we had young people that were participating. Like we had a 5th grade class that went with Dr. VC to the sit-in location, which is now the Ambassador Hotel on Douglas. And so we had them participate. We had them ask Dr. VC questions. And so you'll see that throughout. And then we also wanted to show the impact that the sit-in made today. So we took you from the past to the present. And so you'll see some of the things that are happening today and how the sit-in impacted what we're doing today, how we're approaching the social justice movement today. So those are some of the conversations that we had in the documentary. The documentary, what I can do is send that to Amanda. It's not up in any space in virtual land anywhere, but I can send it to Amanda, and then she can have that available for you to view.
Excellent. Yeah, we can actually link that to this recording that'll be available later this week.
Okay.
All right, I think that wraps up our questions. So thank you so much for being here for that wonderful presentation. Thank you to the Johnson County Library staff who helped make this program possible. And thank you all so much for attending our program today. Please let us know on the poll on your screen, which I will pull up now, where you heard about this program so we know where to advertise in the future. And instead of our regular Past is Prologue program in May, we would like to direct your attention to our annual program in memory of 6 million. Thanks to the U.S. Holocaust Memorial Museum, we will host a Holocaust survivor via Zoom on Thursday, May 12th at 6:30. So watch our website for more details on that. And thank you all for attending today, and we hope to see you at our next program.